So what I want to do is I want to step back a little bit into the history of how I see our community and our movement. And I want to establish a base for a conversation so that we can start to assume some of the fundamentals. We can take some of the fundamental team level stuff off the table and start to really elevate the conversation and talk about, well, once we've built this reliable system of delivery that we can delegate into, how do we start to teach the business how to exploit the system of delivery and maximize its economic value in market? When we think about a system of delivery, everybody here, if you're in this room, you're absolutely familiar with Scrum, extreme programming, things like that. The original Agile systems of delivery were basically small teams of 6 to 8 people operating off of very clear backlogs, able to produce a working test and increment of product at the end of every sprint. Okay, we're trying to take the word software out because software is where Agile came from, but we're using Agile in lots of different contexts: manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, I'm just trying to think, like fast food restaurants, like hotel chains, marketing, rebranding. Agile is everywhere. But the original Agile operating model was this idea of 6 or 8 people operating off of a clear backlog that had everything and everyone necessary to be able to deliver that working test and incremented product. And when I got involved in this field probably almost 20 years ago now, I went out and I got my first real Agile job probably about 13 years ago. I was working for a company here in Atlanta called Version 1. And I was walking into these different companies that were attempting to adopt Agile, and they were attempting to install the Version 1 software. And what I found, the first key insight for me in this industry that I thought was a huge miss, was the idea that we couldn't form teams the right way. And then even if we could form teams the right way, most teams weren't operating off of clear, well-articulated backlogs. They couldn't actually produce a working, tested, validatable, potentially shippable increment of product at the end of the sprint. And I remember thinking, I would go into these companies and I would be like, well, how in the world is anything with team-level Agile going to work if we can't fundamentally get the kinds of teams in place that are necessary to deliver with agility? Because everything in Agile is about, and even the foundation of business agility, right, is about this team that can put things in front of a customer on regular intervals. And so my initial insight was, this isn't about teaching people how to do Scrum or SAFe or whatever. It's really fundamentally a business architecture problem. It's really a teaming strategy problem. So that was kind of the first thing. Everything really else kind of derived from that we're going to talk about, because at the point that you start to think about this idea of teams, backlogs, working tested product, we have to get the teams right. We have to get the teams organized around the right things. And then you have to figure out how to feed those teams backlogs on regular intervals, because the whole holy grail, the fundamental underpinnings of business agility is the idea of, if I can break the work into small pieces, I can have dedicated autonomous teams delivering the work, and I can put the product in front of the customer on regular intervals, I win. So everything else you do around that, how you govern the flow of value across multiple teams, how you build CI/CD pipelines, how you do DevOps, right? Everything else derives from that core first principle. One of the things that we had to try to crack the code on is, when you walk into a large, complex, often multinational organization, what is the organizing story? How are you going to start to pull apart and start to be able to form these teams? And what do you do with dependencies? And how do you deal with orchestration? And what do you do with governance and all these different things? And so where we started to see the industry kind of go was not towards, how do I teach people how to do better Scrum, or how do I teach people how to do better SAFe, but how do I actually begin the process of pulling apart the organization, refactoring it, so that we can create the conditions for the Agile methodologies to really start to take hold. And that was, again, a very powerful insight. So one of the things we're going to talk about as we move into the content of today is we're going to talk about this model that we invented a while ago called the 4 quadrants. And we were talking about the idea of different organizations need to be at different levels of agility. If I'm dealing with a large-scale mainframe system, very tightly coupled, monolith, that kind of a thing, that's going to only allow a certain level of agility that's really different than maybe what we can do with mobile apps, or what we can do with the web, or what we can do with distributed systems or cloud or what have you. And so we started articulating a roadmap for how do I go possibly from a monolith, a tightly coupled technology architecture with a functionally siloed organizational architecture, project-driven versus product-oriented, those kinds of things. Like, what's the process for starting to peel that apart, right? How do you tell that story? And so one of the things we talked about on top of that we have this 4 quadrants model where we talk about predictable, adaptable, emergent, convergent. We'll go into that in a little bit. But then we articulated this strategy that we called expeditions to base camps. And so we were trying to hypothesize around was, how would you begin to approach an organization, break it into thin vertical slices? It's kind of an interesting metaphor, especially if you've come out of the software world. How do you break an organization into thin vertical slices and begin to start to make systematic improvements? So we had this idea of thin vertical slices, expeditions, that were moving to these known states. And it was a powerful metaphor, right? Because what we were thinking about in our head was, if you had a group of people that were taking a journey together, you would want to get them to a known, defined place of safety, kind of let them breathe, let them rest, and then take them to the next place. And so we articulated a roadmap of 5 core base camps, and we called them, they were like described as like, we need to get the organization predictable first. And then we need to start figuring out how to reduce batch size. And then we need to figure out how to break dependencies to actually do the product extraction work, to actually begin the decoupling process. And then the idea of, how do we change the funding models associated with how project dollars come into the organization, and how do we get to the place where we start to figure out how to form teams? Then once we have organizations or teams that are funded independently, how do we begin the process of letting those teams invent and inspect and adapt a little bit more? And that was a super powerful pivot in our way of thinking about stuff. So we were starting to try to figure out, how do we articulate a strategy for moving, getting our consultants and our clients and everybody working together to be able to do this. And we articulated things like outcomes-based plans, and we articulated things, we created playbooks and strategies for engagement and all these kinds of neat things. And what was super cool about it is what started to emerge was a set of repeatable patterns that we could leverage and exploit across the entire portfolio of people that we were working with, okay? So the Elevate Agile story is about, how do we get to a place where we can start to take these 3 circles for granted and say, okay, maybe it's not perfect, but we've laid this foundation. We have a reliable system of delivery that we can delegate into. We have an organization that's relatively dependency-free, that can pivot, that can adapt, that can change, that can redeploy value-focused teams to different problems as the needs of the market emerge. Like, how can we begin to take that for granted so that we can start to talk to the business about what it needs to do now to be able to exploit the new delivery capability that it has?